The soft hues of the evening sky faded into a deep orange glow as George Thompson, a 73-year-old black man, sat on a worn wooden bench in his favorite park. This place, with its tranquil atmosphere, had become his sanctuary, a retreat where the chaos of the world seemed to dissipate. As the cool breeze brushed against his face, George's thoughts drifted through the pages of his life. A civil rights activist in his younger days, he had fought for justice and equality, bearing witness to the triumphs and heartbreaks of change. Yet, even in his golden years, he could feel the lingering presence of prejudice, shadowing the progress he once believed in. As the serene evening unfolded, a distant rumble of a car engine broke the calm. George paid little attention until the sound ceased abruptly, and the sharp slam of car doors pulled him from his reverie. Two police officers, Bradley and Mitchell, emerged, their faces carved with an unsettling intensity. Their mission: find a black suspect accused of assaulting a local store. But their hunt was fueled more by convenience than justice. As their eyes locked onto George, a vulnerable elderly man sitting alone, they exchanged a knowing look. "Perfect," Bradley muttered under his breath. "An easy pick." Mitchell smirked darkly. "No one will question us. Let's get this over with." Unaware of the danger approaching, George remained seated, his calm demeanor masking the unease creeping into his chest. As the officers closed in, their strides purposeful and aggressive, George straightened his back, meeting their advance with a mixture of surprise and quiet dignity. "Evening, officers," George greeted, his voice steady but cautious. "Get up," Bradley barked, his tone devoid of respect. Startled, George hesitated. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, his calm exterior masking the storm of confusion within. "Don't play dumb," Mitchell snapped, his hand already inching toward his baton. "We're asking the questions here. Get up." No. Sensing the hostility, George complied, rising slowly from the bench. But his compliance was met not with patience, but fury. Without warning, Bradley shoved him back, his baton striking George's frail body with cruel force. George staggered, the searing pain radiating through him. "What have I done?" he cried out, his voice a mixture of shock and despair. "Shut up," Mitchell growled, joining in as the assault escalated. Each blow landed with merciless precision, their anger consuming them as they turned the peaceful evening into a scene of brutality. The nearby commotion drew a crowd, horrified onlookers murmuring in disbelief. But as the tension reached its peak, the sound of a second patrol car pierced the air. A commanding figure stepped out, Chief Marcus Thompson. It was George's son. Marcus froze, his eyes locking onto the devastating sight of his father lying battered and bloodied at the hands of his own officers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the weight of the moment crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Stop!" Marcus roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The officers halted, their faces pale as they turned to face their chief. But the damage was already done. As Marcus knelt beside his father, anger and anguish flashed across his face. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice trembling. George's battered face turned toward his son, his eyes filled not with anger, but sorrow. "This is what I fought against, Marcus. Don't let them win." The night would not end there. The officers' actions would spark an investigation, their recklessness unraveling a web of corruption within the department. But the real twist lay ahead, as Marcus wrestled with the moral dilemma of bringing justice to his father while confronting the rot within his own ranks. And as the dust settled, one question remained. Could one man's fight for justice overcome a system built on injustice? This story is not just about brutality, it's about courage, redemption, and the choices that define us. Stay tuned for the resolution that will leave you questioning everything. The scene in the park had become a grotesque spectacle of injustice. George lay on the cold ground, his frail body trembling from the pain inflicted by the officers. Bradley and Mitchell stood over him, their faces devoid of empathy, as if their victim was nothing more than a nameless, faceless burden. "Did you think you could just walk away, old man?" Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. George, his voice hoarse and trembling, tried to protest. "I haven't done anything. You're making a mistake." Mitchell's laughter was cold and mocking. "Mistake?" You're the mistake." Their words cut deeper than their actions, as if stripping him of his humanity. George's heart raced, each beat a painful reminder of his helplessness. His eyes darted around, pleading silently for someone to intervene. Families, joggers, and dog walkers stood frozen, their faces etched with horror. Yet, fear shackled them, leaving them mere spectators to a tragedy unfolding before their eyes. Some turned away, unwilling to risk confrontation. Others simply stood, their indecision louder than any protest they could muster. But one young woman, standing at a distance, couldn't look away. Her fists clenched as she watched the elderly man, a figure of quiet dignity now reduced to a symbol of suffering, being manhandled. Her heart burned with a mix of sorrow and fury. This wasn't right. She glanced around at the hesitant crowd, her frustration mounting. "Are we just going to stand here?" she whispered under her breath. Then louder she shouted, "Stop! What are you doing to him?" The officers' heads snapped toward her, their expressions darkening. "Stay out of this," Mitchell barked. But the woman didn't falter. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking but resolute, and began recording the scene. "You have no right to treat him like this," she yelled. Her boldness was infectious. A few others in the crowd began taking out their phones, murmuring amongst themselves, their indignation slowly overcoming their fear. Bradley's face twisted in anger. "Put that phone away," he demanded, stepping toward her. "Or what?" she shot back, holding her ground. "You're already abusing your power. Go ahead, make it worse." For the first time, the officers hesitated. The presence of multiple cameras, capturing every cruel detail, seemed to puncture their bravado. George, still on the ground, managed to lift his head slightly, his eyes meeting the woman's. In them, she saw gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that her courage had given him hope in a moment of despair. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the air. Another patrol car screeched to a halt at the edge of the park, and a commanding voice boomed, "What's going on here?" Chief Marcus Thompson stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, the trembling figure of his father, the cruel sneers of his officers, and the crowd now emboldened with righteous anger. "Bradley!" "Mitchell," Marcus said, his tone icy and controlled. "Step away from him." "No." The two officers stammered, their confidence crumbling. "Chief, we were just—" "Save it," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through their excuses. He knelt beside George, his voice softening. "Dad, are you okay?" George nodded weakly, his voice barely audible. "It's not okay, Marcus. It's never been okay." As the crowd watched in stunned silence, the tide had begun to turn. Justice wasn't just a distant dream. It was here, demanding to be seen, to be heard, to be reckoned with. And it all started with one voice daring to say, "Enough." The evening air felt heavy as Thomas Thompson, the city's police chief, walked briskly toward the park. His usual route to unwind now seemed charged with an unease he couldn't quite place. A patrol car was parked at the roadside, a sight that shouldn't have been out of place but sent a chill through him nonetheless. Thomas had always held the park close to his heart. It was a serene retreat for him after long, grueling days, but it was more than that. It was his father's sanctuary. George had spent countless evenings here, a place that offered solace from the harsh realities of life. As Thomas approached the patrol car, the distant murmur of a crowd caught his attention. People were scattered near the edge of the park, their expressions a mix of confusion and distress. A young woman stood near the center, clutching her phone, her face pale but resolute. "What's going on here?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying an authoritative weight. The young woman turned to him, recognition flashing in her eyes. "You're Chief Thompson, right?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," he confirmed, now alarmed. "What's happening? You need to see this." She held out her phone, the screen playing back a video she had just uploaded. Thomas's heart sank as the scene unfolded, two officers manhandling an elderly man, dragging him mercilessly toward the patrol car. The man's cries of pain echoed faintly through the recording. But it wasn't just any man. It was his father. Time seemed to stop. Thomas's chest tightened as a flood of emotions overtook him, rage, disbelief, and a deep, aching sorrow. Without another word, he turned and marched toward the patrol car. The sight that met him there was worse than he imagined. George sat slumped in the back seat, his face etched with pain and exhaustion, his wrists still bound by handcuffs that bit into his fragile skin. Bradley and Mitchell stood nearby, their smug expressions evaporating as they noticed Thomas. "Chief," Bradley stammered, suddenly standing at attention. "What the hell is going on here?" Thomas demanded, his voice cold and unrelenting. "Sir, Mitchell began, but Thomas cut him off, his anger barely contained. "You assaulted an innocent man. My father." The two officers paled, the weight of their actions dawning on them too late. "We didn't know," Bradley tried to justify. "You didn't care," Thomas snapped, stepping closer. "You saw an old black man and decided he was an easy target. You disgust me." Turning his attention to George, Thomas opened the car door gently. "Dad, I'm here," he said softly, his voice trembling. George looked up at his son, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice weak but resolute. "Don't let this go unanswered. Not just for me, but for everyone who's suffered like this." Thomas nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "I promise, Dad. This ends here." He turned back to Bradley and Mitchell, his piercing gaze freezing them in place. "You're both suspended, effective immediately. You'll answer for this not just to me, but to the people you swore to serve." The two officers were led away, their bravado shattered. As Thomas helped his father out of the car, the crowd that had gathered began to clap and cheer, their faith in justice momentarily restored. Yet, Thomas knew this was only the beginning. His father's pain was a stark reminder that the system he had dedicated his life to was still deeply flawed. But tonight, Thomas made a vow. He would not only fight for his father but for every voice that had been silenced, every victim of injustice. Change would come, not through words alone, but through action. Jeers from Bradley and Mitchell only fueled his resolve. As Thomas sat beside his father in the patrol car, he leaned closer, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Don't worry, Dad," he whispered. "This isn't over." George looked at his son, his eyes filled with sorrow but also a flicker of pride. "Thomas," he said softly, "they don't understand who they're dealing with. Show them what real justice looks like." Meanwhile, back in the park, the young woman who had recorded the initial video wasn't done. Seeing what had just transpired, she immediately began live streaming. Her voice trembled but carried conviction as she narrated the horrifying injustice unfolding before her. "This is Chief Thomas Thompson, our police chief," she said, showing the patrol car as it began to pull away. "They've arrested him for trying to protect his father, an innocent man being brutally mistreated. This is what's happening in our city, right now. Share this. Let everyone know what's happening." Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire across social media, with thousands of viewers expressing outrage. Citizens began calling the police department, demanding answers and justice. The weight of public pressure was beginning to build. At the station, as the officers dragged Thomas and George inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Bradley and Mitchell wore smug expressions, believing they had asserted their dominance. But their victory was short-lived. The captain of the precinct stormed into the room, his face pale and tense. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked. Bradley smirked, gesturing toward Thomas. "Caught him interfering in our investigation. He's claiming to be the police chief. Can you believe that?" The captain's expression darkened as he turned toward Thomas. "Claiming? That's because he is the police chief, you idiots." Bradley and Mitchell froze, their smugness replaced by shock. "Wait, what?" Bradley stammered. The captain didn't wait for an explanation. "Release them now. And you too, my office, immediately." Reluctantly, the officers removed the cuffs from both Thomas and George. Thomas stood tall, his composure unshaken despite the ordeal. He turned to the captain. "Thank you for stepping in. But this isn't over. These men have abused their power and assaulted an innocent citizen, and their actions have consequences." The captain nodded, his voice firm. "I understand, Chief. We'll conduct a full investigation." As Thomas helped his father to his feet, George placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You handled that with dignity, Thomas." But this fight isn't just for us. It's for everyone. Thomas nodded, his gaze resolute. I know that, and I won't stop until this system changes. No one else should have to endure what we've been through today. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather, holding signs and chanting for justice. The young woman from the park stood at the front, her phone still in hand, broadcasting the unfolding scene. Thomas stepped out with his father, the crowd erupting in cheers of support. Raising his hand to silence them, Thomas addressed the people. This isn't just about what happened to my father and me, he began, his voice carrying over the noise. It's about accountability, fairness, and ensuring that no one, no matter their age, race, or position, faces injustice at the hands of those meant to protect us. Change starts now. The crowd roared in approval, their voices united in a call for justice. Thomas knew the road ahead would be long, but with the support of his community and the strength of his conviction, he was ready to fight for a better future. Strong despite the relentless humiliation, George felt a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow. His son had inherited his resilience, but seeing him endure this kind of injustice was a heart-wrenching reminder of how far the fight for true equality still had to go. The patrol car pulled up to the police station, its red and blue lights cutting through the evening gloom. As the officers stepped out, their arrogance remained unchecked. Bradley yanked the back door open, gesturing roughly for Thomas and George to step out. Out, Chief, Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Let's see if your little fantasy holds up in here. Thomas stepped out with composure, followed by George, who struggled to keep his balance. Thomas instinctively reached out to steady his father, his expression softening briefly before hardening again as he turned toward the station. Inside, the officers paraded their so-called arrests through the precinct, making a show of it. Other officers glanced over, some with confusion, others with quiet unease, recognizing Thomas immediately. Whispers began to ripple through the station as word spread that the city's police chief was in cuffs. Bradley and Mitchell, oblivious to the growing tension, shoved Thomas and George toward the holding area. Before they could proceed further, the precinct captain appeared, his face a mask of controlled fury. Bradley, Mitchell, my office. Now, he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The two officers froze, their confidence wavering as they exchanged uneasy glances. Bradley tried to protest, but, Captain? Now, the captain repeated louder this time. Reluctantly, the officers stepped away, leaving Thomas and George standing in the corridor. The captain turned to Thomas, his demeanor immediately shifting to one of concern and respect. Chief Thompson, he said, his voice quieter but no less urgent. Are you all right, sir? What happened here? Thomas straightened, his voice calm but edged with steely determination. These two officers arrested me and my father under false pretenses. They abused their power, assaulted us, and treated us with contempt, without even attempting to verify who I am. The captain's jaw tightened. I'll handle this, sir. You have my word. Good, Thomas said firmly. Because this isn't just about me or my father. It's about rooting out the kind of behavior that undermines everything we stand for. George watched his son with quiet admiration, seeing the fire in Thomas's eyes that reminded him of his own struggles during the civil rights movement. As the captain escorted them to a private office to remove the cuffs and ensure their comfort, the precinct buzzed with the fallout of the situation. Bradley and Mitchell's smugness had evaporated entirely as they sat in the captain's office, realizing the gravity of their actions. Thomas addressed the captain once more before leaving. I expect a full investigation, and these men must be held accountable. No one is above the law, not even those who are supposed to enforce it. The captain nodded solemnly. It will be done, Chief. As Thomas and George left the station, word of the incident had already spread far beyond the precinct. Social media was ablaze with the footage of their arrest, and the city was rallying behind them, demanding justice. Walking into the night, George placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You handled that with strength, son. I'm proud of you. Thomas glanced at his father, a determined glint in his eyes. This isn't just about us, Dad. It's about changing a system that's been broken for far too long. And I won't stop until we see that change. George smiled faintly, the weight of his own years of struggle easing slightly. Then let's make it happen, together. The two walked on, their resolve stronger than ever, ready to face the challenges ahead in their fight for justice and equality. Soon come to an end. The patrol car finally pulled into the station, and the two officers stepped out, still brimming with unwarranted confidence. Bradley opened the back door, roughly motioning for Thomas and George to exit. "Out you go," Bradley sneered. "Let's see how your little charade plays out here." Thomas stepped out first, his composure unshaken despite the humiliation he'd endured. George followed, his movements slow and deliberate, the weariness of his years etched into his face. Inside the station, officers turned their heads as they entered. Murmurs began to spread, growing louder as recognition dawned on many faces. "Isn't that Chief Thompson?" someone whispered. Bradley and Mitchell were oblivious, their arrogance insulating them from the shifting atmosphere. They pushed Thomas and George forward, dragging them toward the holding area. It wasn't long before the precinct captain stormed into view, his face a mix of confusion and fury. "Bradley? Mitchell? What the hell is going on here?" Bradley smirked, waving dismissively. "Just another troublemaker and some wannabe who claims he's the police chief. Thought we'd bring them in for questioning." The captain's expression hardened as his eyes fell on Thomas. "That wannabe," he said icily, is the police chief. The color drained from Bradley and Mitchell's faces. Mitchell stammered, his bravado crumbling. Thomas stepped forward, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Captain, these officers assaulted and arrested me and my father without cause. Their actions are a blatant abuse of power." The captain clenched his jaw, his fury barely contained. "Bradley, Mitchell, my office." Now, both officers stammered weak protests, but the captain's glare silenced them. Reluctantly, they shuffled away, their heads bowed. Turning back to Thomas and George, the captain's demeanor softened. "Chief Thompson, Mr. Thompson, I deeply apologize for this disgrace. Are you both all right?" George nodded weakly, leaning on his son for support. Thomas, however, kept his focus. "What's important now is ensuring these men are held accountable. This isn't just about us. This is about setting a precedent that abuse of power will not be tolerated." The captain nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Chief. There will be a full investigation." As Thomas and George were escorted to a private room to rest and recover, the station buzzed with the fallout. Bradley and Mitchell's actions had ignited outrage among the officers, many of whom had respected Thomas for his integrity and efforts to reform the department. The video captured by the young woman in the park had already gone viral, sparking a citywide outcry for justice. Protesters began to gather outside the station, demanding accountability and systemic change. Later, as Thomas and George prepared to leave the station, the captain approached them once more. "Chief, the wheels are already in motion. Bradley and Mitchell will face the consequences." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, Captain. But this is just the beginning. We have a long way to go to rebuild trust in this system." George placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "You're doing the right thing, Thomas. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Together, father and son walked out of the station, their bond stronger than ever, ready to continue the fight for justice and equality in a world that still had much to learn. No, he was the chief. Bradley's voice wavered, his earlier bravado crumbling. Mitchell tried to backpedal, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He didn't show us any proof. We were just doing our job." Joseph cut him off sharply, his voice ringing with authority. "Your job? Your job is to uphold the law, not to abuse it. And not recognizing the chief of police is no excuse for this kind of behavior." By now, the entire station was silent, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. Whispers rippled through the crowd, disbelief and outrage spreading like wildfire. Thomas, still handcuffed, stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Uncuff me and my father." "No." Bradley hesitated, fumbling with the keys as his hands shook. He quickly removed the cuffs from Thomas and then from George, who slumped slightly but held his head high. Thomas rubbed his wrists, his gaze piercing as he addressed the room. "This is what abuse of power looks like. It doesn't just happen in some distant place, it's here, right in our own precinct. And it ends now." Joseph nodded, stepping beside Thomas in support. "Chief, we'll handle this. Bradley, Mitchell, hand over your badges and weapons. Effective immediately, you're both suspended pending investigation." The two officers looked stunned, their faces pale and their arrogance shattered. But Mitchell began to protest, only for Joseph to raise a hand, silencing him. "No excuses," Joseph said sternly. "Your actions have disgraced this department." As they were escorted away, Thomas turned to the gathered officers. "Let this be a reminder. Our duty is to serve and protect, not to humiliate and harm. I will not tolerate any abuse of power in this precinct or this city. Do I make myself clear?" The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, the officers nodding in acknowledgement. Thomas then turned to his father, his voice softening. "Dad, are you okay?" George managed a weak smile, his pride for his son shining through despite the pain. "I'm fine, Thomas. You did the right thing." Later that day, the video from the park surfaced online, igniting a public outcry. Citizens flooded social media and news outlets with demands for justice and reform. The story of the police chief standing up to corruption, even when it personally affected him, inspired many and sparked widespread discussions about accountability within law enforcement. Thomas and George walked out of the station side by side, their bond stronger than ever. The battle wasn't over, but together, they knew they could face whatever came next. Justice had been set into motion, and with it, a hope for real change. His voice cracking as he pleaded, "Chief Thompson, please, I beg you. We made a mistake. We didn't mean to harm anyone. Give us another chance." Mitchell, seeing his partner's desperation, hesitated before following suit, his pride giving way to the crushing reality of their situation. "Chief, we're sorry. Truly sorry. It won't happen again. Please don't end our careers like this." Thomas regarded them coldly, his expression unwavering. "This isn't about your careers. It's about the trust you've shattered, not just with me, but with every citizen who depends on us to protect and serve. Do you think apologies can erase the harm you've done? The humiliation? The abuse?" Bradley and Mitchell lowered their heads, unable to respond. Thomas turned to Joseph, his voice steady and commanding. "Lieutenant, I expect a full report on this incident. These two will be placed under immediate suspension, pending a thorough investigation. I want every action they've taken reviewed." Joseph nodded sharply. "Understood, Chief. I'll see to it personally." The station remained deathly silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Officers who had once laughed or looked away now stood solemn, some visibly ashamed of their earlier indifference. Thomas took a deep breath, turning to address the entire room. "Let this serve as a warning. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated, ever. The badge we wear is not a shield to abuse power. It's a responsibility to serve with honor, integrity, and respect. Anyone who cannot uphold these values has no place in this department." The officers nodded in silent agreement, the weight of Thomas's words pressing upon them. Finally, Thomas turned to his father, his expression softening. "Dad, let's get you home." George gave his son a proud smile, despite the exhaustion and pain etched on his face. "You've done well, Thomas. You've shown them what true leadership looks like." As father and son walked out of the station together, the weight of the day's events lingered, but so did a renewed sense of purpose. Within hours, the video captured at the park had gone viral, igniting widespread outrage and calls for reform. The actions of Bradley and Mitchell were condemned, and the police department faced intense scrutiny. But amidst the storm, Thomas stood resolute, determined to rebuild trust and ensure that justice prevailed, not just for his father, but for every citizen who deserved better from those sworn to serve them. Head hitting the floor as his sobs grew louder, his body shaking with guilt and fear. "I never meant for it to go this far. I swear, Chief, I didn't think." Mitchell, too, seemed broken, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please, we didn't know, we didn't think." Thomas stood before them, his voice unwavering, firm in his resolve. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You never thought about the consequences of your actions, about the lives you destroyed with your arrogance and disregard for others. You've not only hurt my family, you've hurt the trust the community places in us. This isn't just about a mistake, it's about the pattern of behavior you've shown. A pattern of treating people with contempt and abusing the authority entrusted to you. A heavy silence fell over the room, punctuated only by Bradley's sobs and Mitchell's fearful breaths. Thomas turned to Joseph, his voice steady but resolute. "Lieutenant, take them into custody. Their actions cannot go unpunished." Joseph nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "Understood, Chief." He stepped forward and motioned for the two officers to be escorted away, as the other officers watched, some with relief, others with sadness. As Bradley and Mitchell were led away, their heads hung low in defeat, Thomas glanced around at the officers who had witnessed the scene. His voice cut through the silence once more, addressing all present. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. We are entrusted with a responsibility far greater than just wearing a badge. We are meant to protect, serve, and uphold justice. There is no room for prejudice, no room for abuse of power. The integrity of this force is not something to be taken lightly. If we fail to hold ourselves accountable, we fail those we've sworn to protect." Thomas paused, letting his words sink in. "You may not agree with everything I do, but know this. I will never allow what happened today to be swept under the rug. Justice will be served for my father, for every citizen, and for the reputation of this force." The room was still, the officers reflecting on the gravity of Thomas's words. He turned then, his gaze softening as he looked at his father. Despite the pain and exhaustion, George gave him a small, proud smile. "You did the right thing, Thomas," George said, his voice filled with warmth and pride. "You held your ground, not just as a son, but as a leader. I couldn't be prouder." Thomas gave a small nod, his heart heavy but resolute. "We'll get through this, Dad. Together." As father and son walked out of the station, they knew that this battle wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, there was hope. Hope that justice would prevail, and that change was possible, no matter how difficult the journey. "Respect. You did the right thing, Chief," Joseph said, his voice deep and measured. "It's not easy to stand up when you're under pressure, especially when it's from those you work with. But you showed us all today what true leadership looks like. Integrity, strength, justice." Thomas nodded, his mind still heavy with the weight of what had transpired. "Thank you, Lieutenant. But this isn't about me. It's about the system. It's about making sure we protect the people we swore to protect, not the ones who misuse their power for their own gain." Joseph's eyes flickered with recognition. "I know that better than anyone. I've seen too many officers forget why they joined the force in the first place. Today, you reminded us of what it means to wear that badge with honor." The other officers stood silently, processing the events that had unfolded. Some exchanged glances, while others remained focused on Thomas, their expressions filled with a mixture of admiration and guilt. The message had been made clear. No one would be allowed to forget the consequences of abusing power. As the room began to settle, Thomas turned back to his father. George's eyes were warm with pride, his silent support unwavering. For a moment, the noise and chaos of the police station seemed to fade, and it was just the two of them, father and son, standing together in the midst of a storm. "Let's go home, Dad," Thomas said, his voice steady. George gave a soft chuckle, his eyes twinkling with love. "I think we've done enough for today, son." Together, they left the station, knowing that while the battle for justice was far from over, they had taken a crucial step in the right direction. The fight for integrity, fairness, and respect would continue, but Thomas knew that as long as he stood for what was right, no matter the cost, he would never back down to see real change. It was a fight for those who had been oppressed, for those who had been ignored, and for the communities that deserved justice. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the weight of his mission lighten, knowing that the people around him were not just his colleagues, but allies in the journey ahead. "You are not alone in this," Joseph said, his voice unwavering. "We're all in this together." Thomas nodded, gratitude and resolve stirring within him. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Together we can rebuild this force. Together we can make it right." The room was now filled with a palpable energy, a shared understanding that change was not just possible, but necessary. Thomas could see it in the eyes of the officers who stood before him, those who had been silent for too long, those who had waited for someone to speak the truth. They were ready. They were willing. A veteran officer spoke next, his voice rough but determined. "I've seen too many good men and women lose their integrity because they were afraid to speak up. But we can't afford to be silent anymore. We have to clean up our house before we can truly protect the public." Thomas smiled, the weight of his father's wisdom echoing in his mind. It was a long road ahead, but he wasn't walking it alone. "Exactly," Thomas said, his voice filled with conviction. "We have a duty to each other and to the people we serve. Today we start the work. We begin the change. And we do it together." The officers who had gathered there seemed to draw strength from his words. They stood taller, more determined, as though the very air around them had shifted. The fear and uncertainty that had once clouded their thoughts were now replaced by a clear sense of purpose. George, standing quietly beside his son, watched with pride. His heart swelled with emotion as he saw the strength and leadership his son had demonstrated. It wasn't just the change in the police force that Thomas was fighting for, it was the very foundation of justice that he had always believed in. "Let's go, Dad," Thomas said, his voice warm as he turned to his father. George smiled, nodding. "I'm proud of you, son. More than you'll ever know." As they walked out of the station, Thomas felt a renewed sense of hope. Today had been a victory, but it was just one step in a long journey. He knew that real change wouldn't come easily. It would take time, persistence, and the unwavering commitment of everyone who truly believed in justice. But as long as he had people like Joseph, the young officers, and his father by his side, Thomas knew they could succeed. And so, the fight for integrity, fairness, and justice continued, not just for Thomas, but for everyone who had ever been let down by those in power. It was a fight that would define their legacy, one decision at a time, with a deep sense of fulfillment and gratitude. He had come a long way, and this moment was the culmination of years of fighting for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against him. But today, he felt the weight of his father's words more than ever. "Thank you, Dad," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." George smiled warmly, his eyes gleaming with pride. "You've always had the strength to make a difference. I'm just glad I was here to witness it." As they stood together, George's hand still resting on Thomas's shoulder, the officers in the station went about their work, each carrying a heavier awareness of the responsibilities that came with the badge. There was no going back to the old ways. The events of the day had changed something in all of them, something that couldn't be undone. Thomas took a deep breath, his mind already turning toward the future. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance. But the path was clear now. He had ignited the spark of reform, and with the support of his father, Joseph, and his colleagues, he knew they could rebuild a force that the community could trust again. As he looked at his colleagues, he saw not just faces of law enforcement officers, but faces of men and women who were ready to do the right thing. They had witnessed firsthand what happens when power is abused and when justice is compromised. And now, they were ready to stand beside him, to face the challenges of restoring integrity to their force. "Let's get to work," Thomas said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. George nodded, giving him one last look of encouragement before they both left the station, knowing that the real work was just beginning. But Thomas was ready. He wasn't alone anymore. And together, they would rebuild what had been broken. For justice. For honor. For the community they served. Apologize for that. You've done more than enough. You've shown me and everyone else that justice is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. You fought for what's right, and that's something no one can take away from you. I'm proud of you not just because of what you did today, but because you're becoming the man I always knew you could be." Thomas looked at his father, the weight of his words sinking in. He felt the weight of his own guilt but also a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had taught him how to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. "I've always tried to do the right thing, Dad. But seeing what happened to you, it made me realize how much more I need to do. I've fought against injustice in the system for years, but now it's personal. I will fight for everyone who doesn't have a voice, especially for you, for the people who are just like you." George smiled, a soft yet proud smile that spoke volumes. "That's all anyone can ask for, son. Just keep fighting no matter how hard it gets. You have what it takes." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The park, once a symbol of the tranquility that George had known, now seemed to carry with it the weight of the day's events, the anger, the injustice, and ultimately, the triumph of standing up against it. Thomas knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war, but as he stood there with his father, he felt more determined than ever. "It's going to be a long road," Thomas said, his voice firm and resolute. "But I'm not backing down. For everyone who's been wronged, I'll make this place a force that people can trust again." George nodded, his face full of love and respect. "I know you will. And I'll be here to support you every step of the way." As the last rays of the sun faded, father and son walked side by side down the familiar path, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they had each other, and that the fight for justice was only just beginning. At the leaves, their quiet presence speaking volumes. The air was still, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the soft rustle of the trees and the distant hum of the world going on outside the park. It was a peaceful scene, but both Thomas and George knew the battle was far from over. Still, in that moment, they understood something profound. True justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about standing firm for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable, even when the weight of the world seemed to be pressing down. And in that quiet reflection, Thomas felt the steadying presence of his father by his side, a symbol of the values that would guide him forward. "I know it's not going to be easy," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. "But with what you've taught me, I know I'm ready. I have to stay true to these principles. No matter how many obstacles I face, I'll keep pushing forward." George nodded, his voice strong and calm. "You've got the heart and mind for it, Thomas. And you've got the strength to make the change that's needed. Just keep your focus on the truth, and you'll never go wrong." They sat there for a while longer, taking in the beauty of the evening, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities for change. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of peace, despite everything that had happened. The fight for justice was ongoing, but he was not alone in it. With his father's unwavering belief in him and the support of his colleagues, he knew that, step by step, they could build a force that would truly serve and protect, one that would uphold the integrity and honor it had long since lost. The evening faded into night, and as they stood to leave, father and son walked side by side, no longer just two individuals, but a united front against the injustices they had both witnessed, each with a renewed sense of purpose and an unshakable resolve to make the world a better place. Uncovered disturbing patterns of behavior that went beyond just this isolated incident. Bradley and Mitchell's previous actions indicated a history of inappropriate conduct and excessive force, often dismissed by their superiors, further highlighting a systemic problem within the force. The investigation also raised serious questions about the broader culture of impunity that had allowed these officers to act without consequence. As the days passed, the investigation expanded, with internal affairs delving deeper into the force's practices and examining the lack of accountability that had enabled misconduct to persist. The review of Bradley and Mitchell's past actions not only revealed a troubling history of disregard for proper protocol, but also exposed how such behavior had been overlooked by their colleagues and commanders. The momentum behind the investigation grew, with many officers realizing that the culture of silence and inaction within the department had allowed a few individuals to tarnish the reputation of the entire force. The more evidence was gathered, the more clear it became that this wasn't just about the two rogue officers but about a deeper failure to uphold the values of justice and integrity that the force was meant to represent. Throughout this period, Thomas stood firm, refusing to compromise on his commitment to reform. He worked closely with the internal affairs team, making sure that the investigation proceeded transparently and without interference. His leadership not only encouraged others within the force to speak out, but also served as a reminder that the principles of justice must be upheld even when it means confronting uncomfortable truths. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the findings were made public, and the results sent shockwaves through the department. Bradley and Mitchell were both stripped of their badges and facing criminal charges. The Internal Affairs report also recommended sweeping reforms within the police department, emphasizing the need for better training, improved oversight, and a stronger system of accountability. The reforms that followed were significant. Under Thomas's leadership, a new era began for the department, one focused on integrity, transparency, and service to the community. A comprehensive review of policies was undertaken, and new protocols were put in place to ensure that future misconduct would not be ignored. Thomas knew that the road to true reform would be long and difficult, but he was committed to seeing it through. The community, too, began to notice the shift. Public trust in the police force, once eroded by corruption and abuse, started to rebuild. People could feel the change in the air. They saw that justice was no longer a concept to be taken for granted, but a reality to be fought for and upheld by every officer, every day. As Thomas walked through the streets, he could see the transformation in the eyes of the people around him. There was respect, hope, and a renewed sense of belief that the force could truly be a force for good. For Thomas, this was not just about restoring the reputation of the police force, but about ensuring that the community could rely on the men and women who wore the badge, knowing they were committed to serving and protecting with honor and fairness. The journey ahead would not be easy, and there would be those who would resist the change, but Thomas was more determined than ever to lead his department in the right direction. With the support of his father, the resolve of his colleagues, and the trust of the community, he knew that together they could build a future where justice prevailed, and integrity was the foundation of everything they did. Pale and tense, their hands trembling slightly as they sat in the defendant's chair. The once confident and arrogant officers, who had misused their power so freely, now appeared small and vulnerable, unable to meet the piercing gaze of the courtroom. The trial began with the reading of the charges, which included misconduct, excessive use of force, and abuse of power. The prosecutor outlined the case, presenting video evidence from the park, eyewitness testimonies, and internal investigation findings that clearly demonstrated the extent of Bradley and Mitchell's wrongdoings. The footage of George being mistreated, along with the officer's dismissive and mocking behavior towards Thomas, was shown in its entirety, leaving no room for doubt about the severity of their actions. Thomas took the stand to deliver his testimony, his voice steady but filled with deep conviction. He described not only the events that transpired that day but the far-reaching impact of such abuses within the police force. His words were powerful, underscoring the responsibility that every officer had to uphold justice, protect the community, and serve with integrity. Thomas made it clear that Bradley and Mitchell's actions went beyond personal misconduct. They represented a larger, systemic issue that needed to be addressed. The defense tried to downplay the severity of the incident, attempting to shift blame onto the circumstances or argue that the officers' actions were in response to a perceived threat. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury listened intently, and it was clear that their decision would not be an easy one to make. The case was not only about holding two officers accountable but about sending a message to the entire police force and the public that misconduct would no longer be tolerated. As the trial continued, the prosecution called several witnesses, including residents from the park and fellow officers, who testified about the abuse they had witnessed over the years and the culture of fear that had prevented them from speaking out. Their courage in coming forward was a testament to the changes Thomas had begun to instill within the department, and it reinforced the importance of holding officers accountable for their actions. The final arguments were made, and after what felt like an eternity, the jury deliberated. Tension was high as everyone waited for the verdict. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the room fell silent. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Bradley and Mitchell were convicted of abuse of power, misconduct, and excessive force. The courtroom erupted in a mix of shock, relief, and anger, but for Thomas, it was a moment of bittersweet victory. The guilty verdict brought a sense of justice for his father, for the community, and for all those who had suffered under the officer's abuse. However, it was also a stark reminder of how far the department had fallen and how much work still lay ahead. As the sentencing was scheduled, Thomas felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. The victory in the courtroom was only the beginning. Now, he had to ensure that the reforms and changes promised to the community would be carried out effectively. He looked at his colleagues who had stood by him through the investigation and knew that together, they could begin to restore the reputation of the police force. The trial's outcome became a symbol of hope for the community. People began to believe once again that justice could prevail, even when it seemed impossible. The police force, under Thomas's leadership, was slowly transforming into one that would be held accountable, transparent, and truly committed to serving the people. As the courtroom emptied, Thomas stepped outside into the bright sunlight, feeling a moment of peace amidst the storm of change. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but with the support of his father, his colleagues, and the community, he was ready to lead the way. The fight for justice was far from over, but today, they had won a crucial battle. The courtroom erupted with a mixture of relief, anger, and triumph as the verdict was read. For the people who had been victims of systemic injustice, and for the community that had long suffered under the weight of corrupt authority, this moment was symbolic. A statement that things could and would change. Thomas stood tall, a quiet strength radiating from him as he absorbed the impact of the verdict. His heart swelled with pride not just for his father, but for the citizens who now saw a glimmer of hope for real change. Bradley and Mitchell, once smug and secure in their positions of power, now sat defeated and broken, their future uncertain. The public apology they were required to give was a formality, one that could never truly erase the damage they had caused. Their sentences, though deserved, felt like only a small step in the journey toward healing for the victims of their abuse. As they were escorted out of the courtroom, their faces were void of the bravado that had once defined them. For Thomas, this victory was more than personal. It was a validation of the values he had dedicated his life to. It was about showing that accountability, transparency, and integrity could triumph over the toxic culture that had festered in the police force for too long. His testimony, his unwavering commitment to justice, had helped shift the narrative, and now the real work was just beginning. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, many approached Thomas, offering words of gratitude and support. Their faces were filled with admiration, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of trust beginning to take root in the community. For too long, people had lived in fear of the very institution meant to protect them, but today, they saw a glimmer of change. Outside the courtroom, as Thomas stepped into the sunlight, he was greeted by his father, George, who had waited patiently throughout the proceedings. The weight of the past few days, the tension of the trial, seemed to lift in an instant as they locked eyes. "You did it, son," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you would." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "We did it, Dad. We fought for what was right, and today, it matters." As they stood together, the community's trust slowly beginning to rebuild, Thomas knew that the journey was far from over. The battle for justice was not a one-time victory. It was a continual commitment to ensure that no one, no matter their position or power, was above the law. With his father's support, the loyalty of his colleagues, and the strength of the community behind him, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning of a much-needed transformation. The trial may have ended, but the mission to restore integrity to the force and rebuild the community's trust in law enforcement had just begun. To protect justice, they had to be willing to hold one another accountable, even if it meant challenging their peers. The atmosphere in the station shifted from one of complacency and fear to a sense of purpose and responsibility. Officers who had once stayed silent now began to speak up, knowing that their commitment to justice was more important than protecting their colleagues who had abused their power. The police department underwent significant reforms, starting with leadership changes and the implementation of new protocols for investigating complaints of misconduct. Internal audits became a regular part of station operations, and external oversight was introduced to ensure transparency. Training on ethics, racial bias, and community relations was prioritized, with an emphasis on restoring public trust. Thomas, now a symbol of integrity and justice, worked tirelessly to ensure the changes were not just superficial but meaningful. His leadership, rooted in the values his father had instilled in him, became a guiding force for the department. The changes were not easy, and there were challenges along the way, but the momentum that had been sparked by the trial continued to drive the reform efforts forward. The public, too, continued to engage. People from all walks of life came together to support the cause of justice and police reform. Town halls, protests, and petitions for change became common occurrences, with the community demanding accountability from those in power. The story of Thomas and George continued to inspire countless individuals, giving them the courage to speak out against injustices they had long suffered in silence. Through it all, Thomas and George remained united in their commitment to justice. Though their journey had begun with personal tragedy, it had evolved into a movement that touched the lives of many. Together, they had shown that standing up for what was right could make a real difference, and that with enough courage, even the most entrenched systems of abuse could be dismantled. The impact of their story extended far beyond the courtroom, beyond the police force, and beyond their community. It became a rallying cry for justice across the nation, a testament to the power of individuals and communities coming together to challenge injustice. And in the quiet moments, as Thomas and George reflected on their journey, they knew that they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. We hold a responsibility that goes beyond the badge or uniform. Our duty is to ensure safety, fairness, and justice for all, regardless of who they are. We are not here to exercise power over others, but to serve and protect the people we are sworn to serve. His words resonated deeply, echoing throughout the community, and further solidifying his role as a leader committed to lasting change. As Thomas stood before the media, he expressed a vision for the future of the force, one rooted in accountability, integrity, and respect. He vowed that from that moment on, no officer would be allowed to hide behind the shield of authority without facing scrutiny for their actions. True reform, he said, doesn't just come from new policies or oversight committees, though those are essential. It starts with each officer examining their own actions and values. It starts with a commitment to do what's right, even when it's difficult. And it starts with building relationships with the people we serve, relationships built on trust, not fear. The message Thomas shared resonated not only with the officers within the station but with the broader public. It was clear that real change was possible, but it required hard work, open dialogue, and unwavering dedication to justice. The atmosphere in the community began to shift, with people feeling more hopeful about the future of law enforcement and more connected to their police force. At the station, Lieutenant Joseph continued to support Thomas's efforts, ensuring that the officers understood the gravity of their roles. He led by example, holding officers accountable for their actions while also creating spaces where officers could openly discuss challenges they faced and areas for improvement. Joseph's leadership became a key pillar in the transformation, guiding the department through the difficult but necessary work of rebuilding its reputation and restoring trust. The public meetings that Thomas organized became regular fixtures, allowing for ongoing dialogue between the community and the police force. These meetings helped bridge the gap between citizens and law enforcement, fostering a deeper understanding of each other's needs and concerns. Through these discussions, many residents who had once felt distrustful of the police began to see the efforts being made toward change, and many officers who had remained silent for too long found the courage to speak out. The reform initiatives, including the establishment of an independent oversight committee and a more transparent complaint process, were implemented swiftly. They were designed to ensure that any officer who engaged in misconduct would be held accountable, and that the voices of the community would no longer be ignored. Thomas worked closely with local government officials, human rights organizations, and community leaders to develop a robust framework for continued oversight, ensuring that progress would be sustained for years to come. As the months passed, the station began to reflect the changes that had been put into motion. The new training programs, designed to teach officers about professionalism, ethics, and the value of community engagement, started to shape the behavior and attitudes of the entire force. Officers who had once been complacent or fearful now recognized the power of standing up for justice and became active participants in the reform process. Though the road was still long and challenges remained, the progress made under Thomas's leadership was undeniable. The trust between the police force and the community had begun to heal, and the lessons learned from the painful events surrounding his father had laid the foundation for a better future. For Thomas, the journey was far from over. He continued to strive for justice and work towards a system where the police force was seen not as a tool of oppression, but as a true guardian of the people. With his father, Lieutenant Joseph, and a growing team of dedicated officers by his side, Thomas knew that the work to rebuild trust and restore integrity was a lifelong commitment, one that he would face with courage, determination, and unwavering belief in the values of fairness and justice. This conclusion beautifully ties together the themes of justice, courage, and community. It reinforces that the fight for justice isn't just an individual effort but a collective responsibility that impacts everyone around us. The powerful legacy of George and Thomas demonstrates how standing up for what's right can spark real, lasting change, inspiring others to take action and contribute to a better, more ethical society. If you were Thomas in this situation, you would need a tremendous amount of bravery and determination to confront both personal and institutional challenges. Standing up against abuse of power, especially when it involves people within your own organization, takes more than just courage. It requires a deep commitment to justice and fairness. It's a test of moral conviction that can change not just your own life, but the lives of those around you. Thank you for sharing this powerful narrative. It's a great reminder that justice isn't passive, it requires action, and it's something that everyone can play a part in defending. I'm sure this story will continue to inspire many who encounter it.